Hello, everyone. Hello. Welcome to the next CyberJar episode. Today we are going to talk about jOOQ, and I am joined today by a very, very high-profile expert, Java champion, Vaadin champion, Oracle Ace Pro, Simon Martinelli. Hello, Simon.
Hello, Catherine.
How are you today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming. I've met Simon for the first time during this year's Spring I/O when I visited his talk at this conference, and you can't imagine the whole room was filled to the brim with people. I mean, people were standing near the windows and sitting on the floor. So Simon is a rock star of the Java world, and I'm very, very pleased that he's joined me today. And Simon, so what are we actually going to talk today about?
We are going to talk about database access.
Database access. Yeah. So we all know JPA, I guess JDBC, right? But there is a third player in town, actually, jOOQ. And Simon is going to tell us all about it. Please share where you are joining us from. Ask any questions that you like to Simon or to me, and we'll try to answer them. I just say hi, and we hope that you will have a very, very productive hour or two. Right. So, jOOQ, why jOOQ? Why not just stick to good old JPA?
Yeah, the problem is that OR mapping is around for many years. So JPA is relatively new. So new in terms of Java, because JPA was introduced with Java E5. That's probably also 2005 or something like that, or maybe 2006. And before we also had OR mapping, like you may know Eclipse Link, that's like Hibernate, so it's an implementation of JPA, and this was named TopLink. And TopLink initially was created by a company called the Object People. That's the reason for the name TopLink. But the first version that they did was implemented in not in Java, but in Smalltalk. And they migrated that or ported it to Java in 1995 when Java started, or 1996. And so we had some OR mapping already before Hibernate. And I started using OR mapping in year 2000 at Swiss Railways in a project, a few years before Hibernate started, in fact. But already there, the problem is that OR mapping is kind of a leaky abstraction because it's not the same model. On one hand side, you have the objects with object identities, and on the other side, you have relational database model. And so that's not a good match, usually. And that's part of the problem with JPA Hibernate. So it's quite difficult to master OR mapping. So it's very easy to start with. So if you do Hello World examples, I'm also teaching Hibernate and JPA at university, by the way. And starting there is very, very, very simple. But it doesn't scale very well in terms of you have to know a lot about the entity state management, for example. You have to know a lot about fetch strategies in JPA. And so that's quite a bit of a problem. So it's not like other specifications like the JMS, the Java Messaging System, which is a very good abstraction above traditional messaging systems. But OR mapping above a relational database is not the best idea, probably, that you can have. And on the other hand, just says, okay, we have a database, let's use that, and introduces a few concepts to work in a more simple way with the database. Because you know, if you want to use JDBC directly, you have SQL in strings, you have the ugly result set that you have to manage when you get the data back from the database. So for example, is it 0-based or is it 1-based? That's a question that you often have. So it's quite difficult to write SQL with JDBC, in my opinion.
Well, yes, I agree. So my choice was primarily when I started learning Java was to use JPA because yeah, it's simpler. than JDBC, but then I encountered that I have some issues with JPA because the more complex the query that you want to write, the more difficult it is, well, to actually write, to make it right, right, with the JPA. So how does jOOQ relate to JDBC? Because jOOQ is also the way to write SQL queries, right?
Yeah.
Java.
Yeah, so JDBC is the foundation for everything. So JDBC is contained in Java. It's the API to access relational databases, and there are drivers from the database vendors. And jOOQ is just a layer above. So jOOQ uses JDBC internally, but you don't have to deal with JDBC directly. You have like a simpler, more simple way to access the database with jOOQ.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's a comment from the viewers that your video is freezing. It is sometimes. So the sound really is okay.
Okay.
There's something with the internet
So
connection.
I tried to do
Yeah.
this, so then I don't stream in full HD. Maybe that's a better choice.
Okay. So jOOQ is something in between the JPA and JDBC. So you don't have to deal with raw SQL, but at the same time, you have more control over your SQL than with the JPA, right?
Absolutely. So jOOQ has more or less two parts, so to say. So you have a domain-specific language, the jOOQ DSL, and the jOOQ DSL is just kind of Java for SQL. So the Java API of jOOQ is more or less the same as you would write SQL. I can show you then some code examples that may help to get the understanding. And on the other hand, what jOOQ also adds is type safety. So if you write SQL statements in strings, now we have multi-line strings. That's much simpler than in the early days of Java. But still you have a string, so no one checks it. I mean, the IDEs like Visual Studio Code or IntelliJ with all the plugins are very, very good in helping you to write SQL statements, but it's not checked. It's just a help. So you get the help from IDE and to write it. But finally, to check if it really works, you have to write a test. With jOOQ, you just can write correct SQL code. If it does the right thing, you still have to test, but you have a DSL that really helps you to write perfect or not perfect, but at least correct SQL code. That's one part. And the other part, you may know the JPA meta model API. So with JPA, you can generate metadata based on the entity mapping that you can use in the criteria API to write queries that really are translatable because they use the generated entity names and the generated attributes that you have in your entities. And jOOQ does the same thing, but it doesn't use any mapping. It directly uses the database to generate the meta model from the database. That means you will get classes that are used to use in the query. So you can have a table name or a column name that you can use. That's the way jOOQ works. So maybe I can show you a diagram.
Of course.
Then this would be simpler.
Okay. Okay.
So this is the architecture of jOOQ. Means we have two parts for jOOQ. One that I already mentioned, it's the domain-specific language on top. And then we have the jOOQ generator that generates the Java classes that you use then. And jOOQ is absolutely database first. So you don't do something like you do with JPA, because with JPA you usually go ahead and define an entity model, and then you map it to the database, or you let Hibernate generate the database tables for you. jOOQ assumes that the database already exists. Now the question is, where does this database come from? And you have multiple options. One option could be you have a running database somewhere and you use that. So maybe that's the not the best solution, because how do you do versioning, for example? What happens if the database changes? That's a bit kind of a problem. On the other side, you could maybe have Lickybase or Flyway for database migrations already. And
Mm-hmm.
jOOQ is able to generate the Java classes also based on these SQL statements. So you have the DDL statements, and then you can generate the Java classes. But that's also not a very good idea, because not everything that maybe your database supports can be derived from the DDL statements. So the
Mm-hmm.
best option currently, in my opinion, is using test containers. Because, for me at least, containers have changed a lot in the way we are building software today. So we don't have to install databases, we don't have to install messaging systems, we don't have to install whatever on our local machines, we just can run a container. And so the idea that I usually have when using jOOQ, I spin up the test containers, apply the Flyway or Lickybase migrations, and then
Mm-hmm.
generate the code based on this database. So I'm sure that my generated classes are exactly what I have in my migration files, and I can use the production database in the test containers to make sure that the classes are generated against the production database. So that's the way I do it. And because this way is very common, there is also a Maven plugin that exactly does these steps that I just described.
Well, that sounds like a magic. Can you show us an example of generating this process?
Okay, sure. Let's switch the screen.
Mm-hmm.
So this is an example from my jOOQ workshop.
Mm-hmm.
And funny thing about that, I just had the workshop yesterday at the public workshop days in Switzerland, in Zurich. And what I use here is a database called Sakila. Maybe people that are using MySQL already for a long time know Sakila. Sakila is a schema. And wait a minute, I have to share my entire screen, otherwise I have to switch that.
Mm-hmm.
This one.
Okay.
So maybe I go ahead to this picture here.
Wow.
This shows the Sakila database, and that's a very old data model, but MySQL used that as a example schema if you want to learn MySQL back in the days. It's about film renting. We don't do that anymore today. We have Netflix or any other of these on-demand movie channels. But back in the day, we were renting films at the store. And so the model here is you have a film. A film can be part of a category or part of several categories. It has some actors that were part of the film. We have a language. We have an inventory in the store. So the store has a certain number of films, and the store will rent the films to customers. So we have rental, we have customers with address, and we have payment, and in the store we have staff. So that's the model that MySQL uses. And the creator of jOOQ, Lukas Eder, adapted this database model to a few very common databases like Postgres, for example. And in my example here, I use Postgres database. Why do I use Postgres? I prefer to use Postgres because it's an open source database on one hand. It's very close to the SQL standard. And if you look at all the other databases that are around, so there are also new SQL databases like distributed SQL databases like jOOQ, for example, and they have a Postgres API. So Postgres in the last few years became kind of the reference API for building something with SQL databases, right? And that's one thing. And the other thing is Postgres starts extremely fast. So on my Mac computer, at least, it starts under a second. And so if you're doing integration tests, starting a Postgres database in a test containers is more or less the same if you would start kind of an in-memory database for development. So that's the reason why I do that. Now, how can I do that? Here, my project is a Spring Boot project. That's just a Spring Boot project because most of the people who are doing Java Enterprise application development today are using Spring Boot. And but that's just one option because jOOQ is absolutely free of any need for a dependency injection framework or any other frameworks. You can use jOOQ just in a public static void main method and just start a database connection with JDBC and use jOOQ. But for the generation, you need this plugin. So you can do that also differently. So sometimes this plugin will not help because you have special requirements based on the database, on the users. But for a lot of default cases, you can just use this plugin. And as you can see, the plugin is provided by the team from Test Containers. This needs some configuration. So for example, I add the jOOQ dependency. I use the Postgres dependencies from test containers and also the Postgres drivers. So then I'm more or less set up. And because I want to generate code, the generation phase will be bound to the generate sources phase of Maven.
Yeah.
And then we have some configuration. So here I say I want to have a Postgres database. Don't do that in production or during development. You should never use the latest tag of any Docker image because you don't know which version, in fact, could be behind that latest tag. I just do that because I don't want to update my workshop every time I do that. And then I can set some names, but that's just more or less the different options that I have from test containers.
Simon, I'll interrupt you for a sec. We have a question from Pasha. How does jOOQ behave under heavy load? Are you following the recent developments? Well,
jOOQ has nothing to do with it because what jOOQ does is it just generates SQL statements like Hibernate does. So jOOQ has no impact on the performance, so to say. So because you write a SQL statement and then you execute the SQL statement, and in that, then jOOQ will generate it. And what jOOQ does, by the way, it always generates prepared statements. And that has two side effects. First of all, if you use prepared statements, you are safe against SQL injection because you have bind variables and you will not get any SQL injection with that mechanism. And on the other hand, the prepared statements are cached by the database because the database, when you execute the SQL statement, the database will generate an execution plan, will parse the statements and do a lot of stuff. And if you have prepared statements, it just has to do that once. So that's, but that's a database optimization, not really an optimization based on jOOQ. But jOOQ doesn't affect, so to say, compared to plain SQL or with JDBC or JPA, that's more or less the same. Doesn't matter.
But do I understand correctly that with the JPA, for instance, or with ORM, in that case, we can have like hidden impacts on performance. So we don't know what kind of a SQL query is generated by the underlying mechanism. So like N+1 and stuff like that. With jOOQ, that might be avoidable, right? Because we control the queries.
Yeah, absolutely. Because jOOQ just more or less generates exactly that query that you write. So there's no magic. As you said, you write the joins, for example. jOOQ also has implicit join. I will show you that in a minute. But what you write gets executed. So you don't have magic behind like you have with Hibernate, where Hibernate might wait to optimize something or whatever. You really get the query that you write. Yeah. So so to say, the performance is in your hands.
Well, Pasha says that it's not that simple. Mapping has a cost. Building of a query has a cost. And please look at the issue 18901. Are you aware of that issue?
The jOOQ issue 901.
Uh-huh. 19. Yeah. So, oh no, 18. Yeah, 18901. Yeah. 908. Okay, I'll check it out too. 18.
This one? No.
Let me see. No, Pasha, maybe you could give us a link to this issue, because I'm curious. Okay.
18909.
19. Yeah. So I am so bad at maths. Spell numbers.
18909. This one is not even open.
1809.
18909. Then let me check.
Okay. Oh, I think I found
I found it.
Found it,
Yes.
yeah.
There's a huge discussion, so I think we don't have the time to analyze that.
Yeah.
But
So-
these are for sure any corner cases, because you can create a very difficult SQL statements. You can create very big statements, and so you may have impacts. But this could also happen if you write the SQL statement by hand. So the generation process here is probably not the problem, because if I see correctly, because what I see here, just we have reflection. Reflection is something you shouldn't use when you process the results, but it's not possible to analyze that on the fly. That's weird. So and probably for the audience that's not really relevant. So from my side, I can say that you don't have any performance issues with jOOQ, because
there's a Lucas Heather in the chat. Oh my
good.
god. Oh my god. So Lucas says, for the record, it's an edge case that appears mainly in a benchmark, not in real world use cases. Besides, the usage of reflection with nested collections is rare. Wow. Well, welcome, Luke. Thank you for visiting the stream. Hello. Yes. So Simon, you were right. That's a corner case. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I thought so, because otherwise I would have that. By the way, I'm using jOOQ for 6 years now in every project I do, and I really didn't have any issues. The issues is the developer sitting on the keyboard, not really the framework. But that's true for every framework.
Yeah, I agree.
So,
all right, so then back to
that. So we have to configure flyway. By the way, we don't have to do that. I just add that for the workshop, that people see what really happens, because this is the default location of the flyway scripts. And then we have the jOOQ generator, and this jOOQ generator uses XML as configuration. So that's just a very small part of what you can configure. But what you usually do is you say which schema that you want to analyze, and then you want to say where exactly the classes should be generated. So based, for example, the package name. By default, jOOQ generates everything into the target generated sources folder. So that's the default folder. But you also can decide to put the generated classes under version control. I usually don't do that, because the generation can run every time, and so I don't need to do that maybe, but that's more a matter of taste. What could be is if you have a very big database. So for example, I have a customer that has an ERP product that has 2,000 tables, and they also have 6,000 SQL procedures or PL SQL store procedures, and jOOQ generates a class per database object. And that means that we have around 11,000 classes that are generated, and compiling 11,000 classes takes a while. So in that case, we just put or do that in a separate continuous integration step and generate the jar file that we put to the main repo and then integrate. But for that, if you have just a few classes or tables like I do, then we can really regenerate that on the fly. And I can run that we can see what happens. Let's check here. So because I'm using this test containers thing, test containers checks for a Docker installation locally, and then it starts its jOOQ container. The jOOQ container is used to manage the containers that test containers is starting, and then it starts the Postgres database. As you can see here, it's under a second, so it's very fast. If you're using Oracle database, there is also an image from Gerald Wenzel. Gerald Wenzel is a product manager at, or used to be the product manager at Oracle database. So he's still working for Oracle, but now has a different job as far as I know. And the Oracle database starts around 20 seconds. So that's not really an overhead in my opinion. And then the red printout here is from Flyway because it applies to Flyway scripts. And then we have jOOQ, and jOOQ analyzes the database. So first of all, it prints out which Java generator parameters that we have set, and then it will detect the database. It will also print out the version, for example. So now we know what the latest version, in fact, is of the Postgres image. And then it, for example, here it finds 32 database tables. One is excluded, by the way, because I said I don't want the Flyway database table. So you can exclude and include everything. So you don't need to generate for all objects if you don't need every object in the database. So you really can very fine-grained configure what should be taken into account for generation of the meta model. And then it finds the database tables, as you can see here, and then it generates something. And the question is, what does it generate? It generates a meta model, as I said, like similar to what we have from JPA, but it's a bit different. So if you look at the actor table, for example, we see that we have in this class a few constants. So you get the constants, for example, for the table name, you get the constant for the column names, and that will be the thing that you will then later use in the queries. We will see a query in a minute. And then we see the columns, and here we have a lot of metadata, right? We know the type, so the Java type in that case. We know the database column name, we know the database type, we know if it's nullable or not, we know if it's a primary key or not. And here, if you are a good database developer, you also comment on tables, you add comments to database columns. So that means you would see the comment of the database also in the Java code, so you don't have to look at the database table. You can use the the comment in the Java class. So that's one thing jOOQ generates. And if we look at how we can use that, for example, let's take this one. Let's start with a very simple one. So for example, we could say, okay, give me all the data from the actor table, and there's a short cut. You can just write select from actor and then fetch. That will execute the select of all columns from the actor table. And now, as you see, I'm using type inference, so I'm hiding what exactly the result type is. And that's the interesting thing, because executing SQL, we also see here, for example, an example with a join. So you can join two tables. But the interesting thing is what I get back, because the problem if you use JDBC is not really writing the SQL statement and execute that. The problem is more processing the result. And processing the result is very often a bit difficult. And jOOQ, let's use that case here, will return records, or better go to that query, it will return a record. A record that's not a Java record, that's a record in terms of a database record. And jOOQ also generates records per table. So a record in terms of the generated record is a one-to-one representation of a data set record in your database. And this record, for example, let's have a look at the actor record, is a class that extends updatable record, impl, and has the fields of the database table. So we have getters and setters for every field in the table. And because this is an updatable record, you can use that as kind of an implementation of the active record pattern to also store the data. So you can create a new record, set the fields, and call store, and then it will do insert or update in the database, depending on if it's a new or an existing record. You can also have delete. So there are some methods here. You have a delete method, and you have a refresh method that you can reload the record. So that's kind of object relational mappings. In term, it's a one-to-one representation of the record in the database.
Okay, well, Simon, I'm a little bit lost here. So jOOQ generates the classes, right, and the records.
Yep.
And there's the record implementation. So what's the difference between the implementation and the record?
So that's my record. And here the updatable record implementation is an implementation of the active record pattern. So the active record pattern says you have a database record class, in that case, that can store itself, for example. So if you maybe know Ruby on Rails, Ruby on Rails is heavily based on active records. They even can generate finders on the record itself, on the active record, because Ruby is a dynamic language, right? You can do whatever you want with it. That's not possible with Java. But here we have an updatable record that I can use to update the data. Let's have a look at this one here. Let's say I want to create a rental. Let's go back to that one. So I want to create a record in the database table for a rental. To create a rental, I need an ID from the inventory table because I want to rent the film, and then I need a customer at least. Will also need probably payment and stuff that is renting or doing the rental for the customer. And so in that case, I create a new record. And here, let's remove that we can see that better. What it creates here with this new record, it creates a rental record instance, right? So that's one of these active records. Why do we need to call new record here? That's the same as you use, for example, the entity manager for JPA. So the DSL here, by the way, is of type DSL context, and DSL context is comparable with the entity manager of JPA. So you have a class that you use to access the database. So the entity manager factory and DSL context are a bit similar to that. And the new record just creates a rental record, but also assigns the rental record with the current database context, so to say. So that means if I later on, so I set the IDs and so on, and if I call store here, the active record has access to DSL context to the save on the database. And because we are here in the Spring environment, I also have the transactional annotation here, and in the test, this will do a rollback. If it would be on production code, it would be a commit by the end, right?
So do I understand correctly that we can use the records that jOOQ generates, as DTOs, and so the mapping is also provided in this way?
Yeah, that's what I said. Or mapping is a bit done, but what we don't have in compare with JPA, for example, we don't map the relationships. So the record here has really only the columns. that belong to that table means it has also all the foreign keys. So the customer ID, the inventory ID, these are the foreign keys to the other tables. With JPA, you would probably map the inventory as an entity, right? You would do a many-to-one mapping, for example, to the customer and a many-to-one mapping to inventory. jOOQ doesn't do that. So we don't do that here with jOOQ. And that's used usually for the writing side, because on the reading side, you very often don't want to have a single row, right? You never do select star from the table. That's not very common. You don't want to do that very often, right? Only maybe if you want to change the data, but just for reading, you want to do projection, right? That's the use case that you normally have. And that means we can do projection, for example, here, but the result of the projection, if you don't define anything, will be something that's quite uncommon, you would say. So, by the way, a result is an implementation of a Java util list interface. So, because every result from the database is a table, every table has an order. Even if you don't define an order by, the database will decide in which order you get the data. And here we have something, also record, but this time a record 2. By the way, we have record 1 to record 22. Record 22 because of the early days of Scala, because jOOQ not only supports Java, but also Scala and Kotlin. And then you can use it in a kind of an idiomatic Scala or Kotlin way. I'm a Java guy, that's why I use Java, no other language. And the record 2 is used to have a type-safe result. So because I'm selecting the film title and the language name, in that case, jOOQ knows that I want to have a result that has 2 strings. And so it gives me back instances of record 2 that have 2 strings as types. So if I have more projection, I will get record 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever. And the record 2 can be used, for example, if we use the result and get the first element, then we can get the data. And if you remember the result set, you need to know, okay, is it positional 1 or 0? And then you have to remember the type, right? You have to know it's a string or if it's an int, because you would call getInt or getString or get something else. And here you can, again, use the generated classes, because I then can say, give me the film title. And this will return a string, for example. So I could use that to work in my application. So that would mean that I will spread over all the meta model all over the places. But very often, if you do a select statement, the best result would be a Java record. So that's probably the way to go, because very often, or in most cases, if you do projection, the result will be immutable. Immutable are records. So I also can use records. So let's see. We have, for example, here, again, a film with a film length this time. And I want to get the result in a class called film length. And film length is a Java record that has 2 components, a name and a length. That's it. And jOOQ will directly fetch that into, that's why it's called fetch into that class. But that's a bit of a problem, in my opinion, because fetch into will use reflection to create the object. So that's not entirely type safe, means here the length, the type of length, by the way, is a short, right? We have a table field that has the type short, and that's why this one is a short. But if I go ahead and say, okay, that's a double, and go back to that code, this will still compile, because there's no check if this really matches the type. There's a better way to do that because we have a mapping. So let's see where I have it. Let's do it like that. There's a fetch method. So there are many fetch methods, by the way. The regular fetch method just returns a list of results or records. Then we have a fetch one, where you can get one or null as a result. We have a method called fetch single that will throw an exception if there is no record with that condition, for example. And we can have fetch optional, which is probably the best way if you don't know if you get the result or not. And you also have fetch lazy, for example. This will open a database cursor if you want to process a huge amount of data. But with fetch, you can use a mapping. So here we have kind of a mapping and say, okay, create a film. And with this mapping here, or with this mapping method, I can pass, in that case, a static reference to my constructor. And now this will be tape safe, because if I go ahead and do the same that I did before, so change the film length and say, okay, this is a double, and go back, now this no longer compiles, because it realizes that it can't create or call the constructor of film length with a string and a double, because or not a double, with a short, because here we have a double, right? So this is what I meant in the beginning about type safe results. So you have type safe queries. So if you, for example, change the name of the title to name instead of title, then your code will no longer compile if you regenerate the meta model. That's the same as you have with JPA, with the meta model API. But we also have type safe results. So JPA, for example, has the possibility to use constructor expression. So you have to select new and then can execute a query that will also do, for example, an instance of a record, but there's no check if the result from the database really can be mapped to the object that you want or to the class that you want.
That's nice. That looks really neat. I have a couple of questions. The first one is kind of a housekeeping question. So as I can see, jOOQ compiles and creates the classes in the target folder directory. And if we need to use these classes in our source folder, like for example, in services and controllers and validations, what's not. So do we actually transfer all that jOOQ has generated into the source directory or not? How do we
No,
do
I usually keep it in the target directory because this will land in the jar file by the end, but I don't want to have that under version control. But as I said, there are teams that want to have that under version control as well. So maybe the developer experience is better if you have it in version control, so you can just clone the repo and run it without running Maven before. Otherwise, you have to run the Maven build. By the way, there's also a Gradle plugin for people who prefer Gradle over Maven. So in fact, it doesn't matter. Even there is a CLI where you can directly run Java to generate the meta model. You don't need Maven or Gradle at all if you prefer Ant or nothing, depending on how you work. But usually people use Maven or Gradle, so this got you covered. So now we know how to process the results. But in my opinion, there is a superpower with jOOQ because jOOQ can do something that Hibernate can't do.
Oh, intriguing.
So what jOOQ can do is return nested results.
Oh.
So you can do that with Hibernate in terms of entities, right? You can define relationships to one, to many, and if you don't take care of the fetching strategy, you will get n+1 select problem, and this will cause performance issues in production. And in my opinion, if you really do reading data and you want to read data that you don't want to change, and that's most often the case. You have a REST API, for example, you want to return something, some DTOs, for example, that goes over the API. What a lot of people do with Hibernate is to use entities for fetching, and then they use mapstruct or object mapper or model mapper, to map it to DTOs. That's a very, very stupid idea. That's, in my opinion, an anti-pattern, because what you do, you read managed entities, because you could change these entities. Hibernate will take care. Hibernate has a stateless session that has or mitigates that problem a bit, but JPA doesn't have that. They have the entity manager, and every entity you fetch with the entity manager is managed. And probably you don't want to do that, and then you have to take care of the lazy loading stuff. And but in the end, you just want to read the data from the database. And here we also have an example. But first, let's have a look what the result should be. What I like to do is I want to have a record with the name of the film, and then I want to have a list of films. A film has just a name, so you know that's a tree, right? I want to return that, for example, in the REST API. And jOOQ can do that and return exactly that data with a single SQL statement. So Hibernate, depending on how you set your entity graph or do the join fetch, will also just execute a single SQL statement. But the problem with the single SQL statement with Hibernate is this will be a product of the two tables. So you have redundant data in the result set, first of all. And the second problem is if you want to sort, for example, the film in the category, you can't do that with Hibernate. Because you can't do sorting of the entity mapping at query time. But with jOOQ, you can do whatever you want. So let's have a look at this a bit more complex query. So we have the select of the category name. So that's the outer things. And then has jOOQ a multiset method. By the way, the DSL class is used or has a lot of functions that you can use together with jOOQ. Like there are the count or sum or average aggregation functions and other things. And we have the multiset. And with the multiset, I can say, okay, internal, we have an internal select statement. So that's inner select statement on the film title. Then we have here, for example, a join. And then I can say that the result of this multiset, I want to convert to the film record. So that's the inner type that we want to fetch. And then I say, okay, from category, and finally I fetch that in the category with films. And if I run that, we can see that we get a single SQL statement. So let's find it here. And here we have the SQL statement. Let me remove that so we can see it. And that's a query that's get executed, right? If you set the jOOQ logger to debug, then you get always the SQL statement plus a sample of the data. So it doesn't return or doesn't sample all the database, just in that case, the 5 first rows. And if you have a look at the query that was executed, then we see the magic trick jOOQ is using to do that. Because databases are able to return nested structures for a long time. You know, usually the result of a SQL query is always a table. But there are exceptions. For example, we have XML in the database since the 90s. So we could return an XML structure and map the XML structure to database or to Java objects, for example. jOOQ uses JSON because the JSON support of most databases is getting better and better. So there are even databases that can store JSON, or here in that case, we have the JSONB functionality of Postgres in that case. So if we execute the query against a MariaDB or an Oracle database, the query would look different. Since jOOQ is also an abstraction of the database, you can move to another database and keep the queries, because jOOQ will take care of the SQL dialect of the underlying database, how to build the query and how to execute it. And here we just use JSON aggregate and a build array. And here we see the kind of a nested table that is used for the film category. And this will return the data that we need in one go, and then jOOQ will map it to our record. And even this is type safe in all times. So we have the query that is type safe using again our meta model. And here with the convert from and the mapping or the fetch, the mapping in the fetch, we will get the objects. And because we use this constructor reference, we also have a check if the types are correct.
Amazing. That's really powerful. I love it. Love it. Is there anything that that is non-trivial with jOOQ? Is there anything that jOOQ doesn't support or struggles with, so that we get to know what we are dealing with?
The problem with jOOQ is that you have to know SQL.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people that are using JPA don't really know how SQL works. Because SQL is very powerful. And if you want to know more about how powerful jOOQ is, by the way, you can watch the videos from Lukas Eder, from his talks that he had a few years ago, because he was showing how powerful SQL could be. So a lot of processing that developers very often do in the Java application could be done on the database side. And I'm not speaking about stored procedures. I'm just speaking about plain SQL statements where you can calculate, for example, things, and then you can return that and directly map it without doing the processing on the Java side. So that's something that's quite important. For the people that are using stored procedures, jOOQ is brilliant for them, because what jOOQ will do, it will generate the class from the stored procedure. And in fact, we have a stored procedure here. And let me check where I have that. Function test, that's probably, no, that's not this one, that's that one. And we have a stored procedure that's called inventory in stock. And that's really a PG SQL stored procedure in Postgres that is calculating the current stock for a certain film. And as you can see here, we have a static method on a class that's called inventory. No, that's on the routines class that's also generated. And we can directly use that to call that stored procedure. So that means with jOOQ, executing a function or a stored procedure is the same as just calling a Java method. And if you ever have to try, or if even using JDBC for that, it would require to use a callable statement. And that's very tricky, especially if you have in and out parameters for the stored procedure that you want to call. And Hibernate doesn't make it simpler. So also with Hibernate, that's relatively complicated. And here, that's very simple. I know that a lot of people don't like stored procedures or don't do stored procedure. But if you work with legacy system, you always have stored procedures somewhere. And jOOQ is the best way to use that.
Can we use the jOOQ in production applications? Like, does it have any commercial support?
Yeah, the point is jOOQ has kind of a dual licensing model. That means if you're using the latest version of Postgres, as I do here, jOOQ is for free. So because jOOQ is open source, but because jOOQ supports a lot of databases, SQL databases, jOOQ has a model that if you're using a certain commercial database, like Oracle, for example, you have to pay a license fee. And the licenses are bound to the developers, so you don't pay for production, you pay for development. And the licenses are floating, so you need just for the developers that are really using jOOQ, you need the licenses, and they are not very expensive. So for example, for Oracle database support, you pay around 300 euros per year for the license. And the point is, if you have that with the dual licensing model, you also have sustainable open source, because then you have developers who can work on jOOQ, and especially because jOOQ supports this many databases, you really get support for everything. You can also have legacy databases. You will also have support for older versions that are no longer supported, for example, in the open source model, for example, if you have an old Postgres database somewhere in production, you still can use jOOQ for that.
Well, that's nice to hear. And jOOQ, well, it's not a new project, right? It wasn't born yesterday. And I know that Lucas is, well, the main driver behind jOOQ, the father of the project, so to say. Do you know if the project has any other maintainers besides
Yeah,
Lucas?
you can have a look at the commit history, for example, or also on the jOOQ page. There you can see the contributors that are working on jOOQ. But that's true. Lucas is the father of jOOQ and still the main maintainer of the product. By the way, fun fact, Lucas is probably the only person in the world who has filled at least one bug report at any databases jOOQ supports.
Amazing. Well, the powers and the energy of Luke, they're so inspiring, and you can't believe that one person actually maintains this absolutely lovely, beautiful project. But there is the issue that enterprises may have with that. So if Lucas decides that he doesn't want to do the project anymore, so who is there left to maintain it? And our enterprises are going to be left with the project non-maintained. So
Yeah, the first thing is that if you're a paying customer, you also get the source code for the database specifics that you are using. For example, if you're paying for the subscription for Oracle, you also get the Oracle source code. So that means you could bug fix it by your own if you want to do that. But if you look at the company list that you can find on the jOOQ page, you can see that there are big companies, very big companies, also in Switzerland using that, like banks, railway companies, or big enterprises. And so there is a lot of investment in jOOQ as the language itself, or as in jOOQ in the using jOOQ. So in my opinion, this will stay even if Lucas will not be there. So there will be a lot of interest in that to run it even
yeah.
when Lucas stops.
Yeah, well, I'm looking at this list right now, and it's pretty impressive. Yeah, so many huge companies actually use jOOQ. So I think we can be, well, we don't have to worry about that, right? So
Exactly.
the jOOQ will leave. Simon, tell me, if somebody wants to migrate the project from JPA, for instance, to jOOQ, is it even possible?
Yeah, I mean, you can also mix JPA and jOOQ.
Really?
Because, or if you want to do a transition from a JPA project to jOOQ, I would always recommend to mix it. So because the power is, as I said, the multiset, we also have a row value construct beside that. So you can also fetch nested to one relationships. I don't have an example for that, I think. But I have an example for JPA. So in my project here, I have entities, just two. So I have a category entity, and the category entity has a many-to-many relationship to a film entity. And these are regular JPA entities. And what a lot of people don't know is that you also can use SQL to return entities with Hibernate. Means I can go ahead and say, okay, I want to select from the category every row, every record. And instead of calling fetch to get the result, I say get SQL. And get SQL will return the SQL statement. So jOOQ will generate a SQL statement that it would execute against the database and return it as a string. And then I can use create native query method from the entity managers and say, okay, that's a SQL statement. And the return of the SQL statement should be mapped to category entity. And even category entity has internally the one-to-many mapping. If I run that, then you will see the following. So we will see not the jOOQ statement this time, but we will see a Hibernate query.
Mm-hmm.
So that's
Yeah.
the query for the category, and this is executed by Hibernate. And then for sure, what do we get? Because here is a print line for that prints out categories, and categories or the category has a toString method, and the toString method prints out the films. So we just generated a nice little n+1 select problem with Hibernate, but here we can see that it really works. So you really can mix that. You can construct the queries instead of, in my opinion, the worst API that you can get is the criteria API from JPA. I teach that for, let's say, 17 years, I think. And every time I do that, I have to look up the documentation to understand how criteria API works. So to get rid of the criteria API queries or get rid of the strings in your application, you just can use jOOQ to generate the SQL statement. And that's a very good combination. The question is, do you really want to do that? But as an intermediate result of your migration strategy, the mixing like this could be a good idea. And then you can throw away your map struct or model map framework and just use the multiset operator and plain SQL statements to get your DTOs back from the database.
Wow, that's pretty impressive. And I didn't know that you can actually mix JPA and jOOQ. I will surely try that out. Simon, do you have this project somewhere on GitHub so that we can share with our audience?
Sure.
So yeah, if you don't mind, just paste the links in the chat, and I'll.
This is part of a workshop. So if someone is interested, I could give the workshop online or as a company workshop, by the way. And let me see where I have, or I put it here in the private chat so you can share it, because I don't see the chat window. And here on this side, you see the slides from the workshop, by the way. The workshop slides are more or less pointers to the database, to the documentation of jOOQ, because jOOQ has a very extensive documentation. And then here on top, you will find the link to the workshop. By the way, the test that I've shown you, there are exercises that you can do. That's part of the workshop. But there's also a demo package, and the demo package is from the jOOQ demo. So jOOQ has its own demo project, and I ported that to Spring Boot. So I have a jOOQ test contains test base class that is a Spring Boot test, and that imports test contains configuration to use the Spring Boot test container support. Now, people knowing Spring Boot may ask, but you're testing the database layer, why are you using Spring Boot test? Because Spring Boot has the test slicing concept. So you can have a test slice like data JPA test that just starts JPA and the database or the database connection. So to say, I could use a jOOQ test. And that's also contained in the Spring Boot jOOQ starter. And jOOQ test would just create the DSL context configuration plus the database connection. But because I'm mixing JPA and jOOQ, I cannot use that and use Spring Boot test instead. So that's the reason for Spring Boot test. If I just had jOOQ in my tests, I would just use jOOQ test as an annotation. And maybe what you also find on that page, there are 3 links, because I created a few very tiny libraries that help me to use jOOQ in my projects, and they're open source. So jOOQ Utilities has an equals hashcode generator, a special one. Then I have a Spring integration where I try to mimic the Spring data repositories for jOOQ. And then, because I'm a big Vaadin fan, I also have a jOOQ Vaadin integration, especially for data fetching with the Vaadin framework. So that's all part of this page. You can have a look at it.
That's beautiful. Beautiful. Yeah. Friends, if you have any questions for Simon, that's high time you ask them. So don't be shy. Any question? For me, for my part, at the end of the day, Simon, so should we use jOOQ in any scenario, or are there cases when we should stick to JPA?
I don't see a reason to stick with JPA. So maybe as I can show this slide from the workshop as the final slide, so to say, because JPA and jOOQ have two different concepts. So on one hand, if you do JPA, you have this so-called entity state transition. So you load entities, you traverse the entity graph, you change the state of the entities, and finally you tell Hibernate store it on JPA. And you don't have to care about how this is stored. You don't have to care about how this is loaded. So that's another abstraction level. If you use jOOQ, you have this so-called data set transformation. You load data in form of records, and you can change the records, or you can do inserts, update, delete statements directly, and you always rely on the data set. You don't rely on an entity model, right? And that's the main difference between the two approaches. And as it's written here, neither one is the best. So it really depends what you want to do. But you also can do domain-driven design with jOOQ. You don't need Hibernate to do domain-driven design, by the way, because there you may have entities, but these entities just result in the call of a repository by the end, and this could be done with jOOQ. But I would do it the other way around. I would always, if I have a SQL database, I always use jOOQ by default. And if I see maybe an advantage in using JPA, I could add JPA. But by default, my default is jOOQ and not JPA.
I see. Oh, sorry, I'm muted. Well, that's actually really, really nice. Friends, I encourage you to follow this link that Simon gave us. I posted that in the chat, and it is also going to be in the description. It's already there in the description of the live stream. So follow this link, try out jOOQ, study the samples, see whether you might want to use jOOQ for your next project, or you want to migrate to oops, Simon disappeared. All right, I hope he will come back for the final goodbyes. But anyway, I encourage you to try out jOOQ. And well, the man doesn't live on JPA alone. And it's oops, Simon's back.
Sorry.
I thought, okay, my time's up. I'm a busy man.
I wanted to stop the sharing, but I hit the wrong button, so sorry about
Oh,
that.
I see. Right. Okay. So yeah. So again, friends, I encourage you to try out jOOQ because it's always nice to try out new things. It makes life as a developer more interesting, and who knows, maybe you will actually want, and I'm sure that you will want to make your next project based on jOOQ. And you can, of course, write to me or to Simon, ask questions. You can write to Lucas, I guess, somewhere. Simon, where do you usually dwell these days? Where can our audience find you?
You can find me on any, not any, but at least on LinkedIn, Blue Sky, Mastodon, or X. You can find me. You can also go to martinelli.ch and send me a message. If you need support or advice on jOOQ, there is also a link to book a free consulting session with me. And then you can ask anything if you like to. And then we can see from there if you need more support or not. So I'm open to anything, any conversation about jOOQ or any other topics would be very helpful for me
Yes.
or for you. And it would be a pleasure to do that for me.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Simon, for coming. That was an amazing session. I loved it very much, and I think our audience loved it too. Yeah, so I guess we can call it a day today. Thank you again so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you for coming, your amazing audience, and until next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.